Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us. We're really pleased that so many of you have registered to join us for this event. Please remember that tolerance recognizes the universal human rights and fundamental freedoms of others. People are naturally diverse, but only tolerance can ensure the survival of mixed communities in every region of the globe. So thank you for joining us, and hopefully this will be a meaningful evening for you. In terms of general housekeeping, I'd like to remind you that if a fire alarm goes off, please leave your home. It's not us, it is you. So please be safe, and we'd appreciate your making sure that you remain on mute unless you have a question. And please feel free to use the raise hand or the chat function so we can recognize that you have a question for us. We'd like to specifically welcome Graham O'Neill from the Scottish Refugee Council, who's made some real efforts and special efforts to make sure that he can join us and make a contribution. We'd also like to remind you that this is part of Mitzvah Day, and Mitzvah Day is the opportunity for us to call to action and to make change. So please identify things that you, within yourselves or within your communities, can do differently. And I'd now like to turn it over. Thank you very much for joining us.
Hi, everyone. I'll join Susan in welcoming you. My name is Sabina Chalmers, and I work for Scottish Faith's Action for Refugees, of which Jewish communities across Scotland through Skojec are members. I'll be leading you through the evening, giving you various input throughout the night, in addition to Graham O'Neill, and we're very happy that he can join us. I've been working with refugees and asylum seekers for the best part of my working life, both abroad and locally here in Edinburgh. It's been a real joy to support Syrians being resettled here in Scotland. And so I really look forward to guiding us through the evening. And I'm really glad that this is also part of your Mitzvah Day initiative. I hope this evening will just renew all of our enthusiasm in terms of engaging the stranger and as we reach out to our neighbours in need. I'm not sure if you've followed much of the media in recent weeks, but it probably wasn't going unnoticed that immigration is right at the top of many media reports again. There's a discussion about people crossing the channel, atrocious suggestions that asylum seekers could be shipped off to remote islands in the Mediterranean, asylum seekers being evicted in the middle of a global pandemic, and the resettlement of refugees hasn't started yet, even though deportations have started in Scotland. So in the midst of all this, some news agencies feel pushed to produce headlines that distort the truth about immigration and to demonize minority groups in our societies. And I think this matters above all because we're speaking about real people, and it's having a real impact on people's lives. Hate and division are spread, and misconceptions are created, prejudice is reinforced. We now live in an openly hostile environment where the aim of the government is where it's the aim of the government to make it as difficult as possible for certain groups to live in the UK. So the topic tonight, refugees in Scotland, seems very, very relevant in the time that we live in at the moment. And I think it's just really important that we are a light in these dark situations, but it's always important to think about kind of refugees in Scotland, how we can engage with them in a broader context. So what I'm going to do is give you a little bit of a global overview, what the situation is across the world, and then Graham will give us a bit of a Glasgow focus. Glasgow hosts almost the entire population of asylum seekers in Scotland, and then we'll think further about integration for refugees, barriers to integration, and what we can do practically. So that's what our evening will look like. So if you just give me a minute, I'm going to share my screen so you can follow along a bit better what I'm saying. I hope you can all see that. So the The United Nations Refugee Agency estimates that there are almost 80 million people forcibly displaced around the world. 26 million of these are refugees, and refugees are people who have crossed an international border and are therefore protected by international law. And therefore they're also fundamentally different from migrants. Some newspapers like to call everybody a migrant, but that simply is not right. Refugees have been granted asylum and protection in a safe country, which means they have the right to live there. 45 million people across the world are internally displaced, which means they've had to flee within their own country. And they're therefore in a very vulnerable position because they neither receive protection from another country and most likely not from their own country either. To put things into comparison, 6 million people have been forced to flee Syria through the war, and 6 million people are also displaced internally in Syria. So it is one of the bigger displacement crises at the moment. Over half of the world's refugees are also children. And as you can see on the chart here, 2/3 of refugees are actually hosted by the global south or countries neighboring areas of conflict. So most refugees stay close to home. Turkey, for example, is the largest host, hosting 3.6 million refugees. Lebanon, in comparison, is the largest host of refugees per capita. They host one in 6 people is a refugee in Lebanon. And last summer, I spent some time in Jordan, in Mafraq, which is a town just south of the Syrian border. And over half of that town's population of 200,000 were refugees. So we're talking about very different scales. If you look at the chart again, only 6% of refugees actually come to Europe. So numbers arriving in Europe are actually as low as they've been in since 2015. So compared to other parts of the world, we are in the UK very, very far removed from what the media likes to call a refugee crisis, or even worse, what politicians like to call an invasion. In a world where one person is displaced every 2 seconds, that's over 37,000 people a day. We're also not talking about kind of one single refugee crisis, as the media likes to call it, but we talk about kind of the mass displacement of millions of people across the world. It's not just the Syrian crisis, but also less well-reported conflicts like Yemen, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Venezuela. Just to give you 2 examples, in Venezuela in 2018, 3 million people left the country. At one point, over 5,000 people were crossing the border from Venezuela every single day. And just a very current example of Ethiopia. We can follow the news as a new displacement crisis developing there, but actually in 2018, over 1.6 million Ethiopians were already displaced internally inside the country. And at the same time, Ethiopia is the 2nd largest host to refugees in Africa. So I hope all of this gives you a bit of an impression of how complex these issues are across the globe, how they actually affect every single continent, and again, how far removed we are from what the media calls a crisis. There's lots of tragic situations, and I just like to remind us at this point that these numbers are really overwhelming, that we're talking about individuals, human beings who have their own stories and their own loved ones and hopes and dreams and joys and hardships. And I think that's always really important to remember when we speak about these issues. So then where are we at coming closer to home as a nation, UK and Scotland? There are some pictures which move the world, and this one will be very, very familiar to you. Some pictures change the world, and some pictures move governments to act. And this is actually one of those pictures. It was circulated in 2015. It was on every headline in the newspapers. It's the body of a boy called Alan Kurdi, which was found on the Turkish shore when civil war had erupted in Syria. Abdullah, who is Alan's father, and his family were forced to flee their homeland. And when their struggle for everyday survival just became too difficult, they decided to make that impossible choice of crossing the Mediterranean. And unfortunately, tragedy struck and their boat capsized. And Abdullah's wife, Rihanna, and their two boys, Ghalib and Alan, died. And this photograph of Abdullah's youngest son went viral. And this picture became an image to the whole world that actually this refugee crisis affects every single person, and nobody is really immune to the harm and hardship. So unfortunately, it did take such a harrowing picture for the UK government to act. But in 2015, shortly after the picture was published, David Cameron announced that the UK would commit to resettling 20,000 Syrian refugees over a 5-year period. So up until now, the UK has almost fulfilled its promise, resettled close to 20,000 Syrian refugees. And Scotland has taken a very generous proportion, just over 3,500 Syrian refugees. And Syrian refugees have been resettled in every single local authority in Scotland, all the way from the borders to Shetland. So no matter where you live and stay at the moment, there are opportunities to actually welcome refugees, which is wonderful. Scotland has been one of the most generous regions in the UK, and yet it's important to note that nevertheless it's a tiny percent of the population, like 0.05% of the population. So still very small numbers. In addition, just to give you the full picture, there's a vulnerable children's resettlement scheme, and Scotland has accepted 250 people through that, and there's a gateway programme. But all of this will change in 2021 when all resettlement schemes will be combined to one global scheme. And the UK government has committed to resettling a further 5,000 refugees in 2021. And they will not only be Syrian refugees, they will be resettled from where the humanitarian need is the greatest. So we might be welcoming many more nationalities. Yeah, in addition, there are a large number of asylum seekers, as I've said, and their situation is very different from resettled families. I should maybe say that people who are resettled are identified in refugee camps in places like Jordan and Lebanon by the UNHCR, and then flown directly to the UK. So they don't face the journey that many asylum seekers face to come to the UK. So there are about 4,000 asylum seekers currently in Scotland, and most of them are in Glasgow. Glasgow is the only dispersal city, and Glasgow actually hosts the highest number of asylum seekers of all local authorities in the UK. So again, very, very generous. I'm going to hand over to Graham in just a moment to tell us more about Glasgow. He's just the absolute expert on this topic. But before I do that, I just wanted to, oh, there we go, highlight our organisation that I work for, and how also you are all connected to this work. The same picture that moved the UK government to act was actually the one that brought many faith groups to the realisation that they can't just, watch and do nothing. And so faith groups came together to found Scottish Faith Action for Refugees, and this was set up as a multi-faith partnership of all the main Jewish, Christian and Muslim communities, as well as interfaith communities. And we work together to create a more welcoming Scotland, and we do awareness raising and policy work, as well as just offering support to local faith groups who would like to extend a hand of welcome to refugees locally, do capacity buildings and trainings, and similar things. So that's why I'm also here tonight. And many of you have been part of this great work. Jewish communities are represented through SCOJIC as part of Scottish Faith's Action for Refugees, and have spoken out over the years on the issues that refugees face. So I'll just I'll just stop my screen sharing now. And is Graham here? Danielle, do you want to drop him a wee line, maybe an email or so? That would be great.
Yeah, let me just try and get a hold of him.
Thanks. He must be held up. Sorry about that. Why don't I continue in the meantime, and then we can pick it up whenever Graham joins us. I'll just start sharing my screen again. Danielle, you just interrupt me.
Yeah, I've just turned off my screen so I can try and give him a call.
Lovely. Sorry about that. Great. Let's continue. I think we're back at the start of my presentation. Right. What is really encouraging is that the Scottish Government has also set itself the aim to be at the forefront of supporting refugee integration. So they put together a refugee integration strategy with many of its main partners that looks at how they can support refugees in Scotland, as well as asylum seekers. And for the first time next year, there will actually also be money attached to the strategy. So up until now, the strategy was there, but it was just up to organizations with their own funds to implement, but that will change next year, which is brilliant. What this strategy says, and what the Scottish Government says, is that they would like the integration of refugees to start from the very first day that somebody arrives here. So both asylum seekers and refugees don't need to have a certain status or language skills to start their integration process. It just happens, should start from day one. And the other very exciting thing is that integration is a two-way process, which means receiving communities and refugee communities are equally part of the integration process. It's about giving and receiving and learning from both sides. Both make efforts to live alongside each other. And the great thing about this is that we all have a role to play. The onus of integrating to a society isn't on a refugee alone, but actually on each one of us to extend a hand of welcome and to be ready to be changed ourselves by our encounters with refugees. And that's just really good news. I think we'll break out into discussion time now. It'll be great to think a wee bit more about the refugee experience ourselves. So
the logic where...
Are we ready to go? They're set up.
I'll just give you the question. So if you could think about in your groups, in your breakout rooms, what would you need to know or have if you were to move a country? Just imagine you were moving, and what would you need to know or have to be part of a community? So just brainstorm as a group and think about that experience of moving and what you would need to know or have. Okay, and then we'll meet back in about 4 minutes and feedback. Thanks, Jean. Lovely. I hope you had good discussions in your group. We'll just maybe hear from Graham first, and then we'll feed back from what you've chatted about in your separate groups. Graham, we're very, very happy that you're able to join us. Thanks for coming, and thanks for giving us a bit of an overview in what's happening in Glasgow.
Okay, no, thank you very much, Sabine and Danielle. And at first I'm sorry for the delay. I was hoping to join you around 6 o'clock today. I've got 3 young children, so I've kind of bribed them I've given them some ice cream downstairs to have. I don't think any of them will come in, but I just can't guarantee that. But yeah, I'm really, really delighted to join you all here, and we are really delighted at Scottish Refugee Council to be invited by Sabine and Danielle to do so. And my name's Graham O'Neill. In terms as far as job titles goes, I'm a policy manager at Scottish Refugee Council, and I'm sure many of you will know about Scottish Refugee Council. The group I was in earlier there, I think it was Carol was talking about experiences that she's had way back in '86 and onwards. So the way I'm not here is, God, the last thing I'm here as is an expert to come and talk. My way of being, I try my best is to very much be open and learning all the time. I've found that when I've succeeded, has served me well. So rather than me coming and talking, obviously there's stuff that I'll share, but it'd be lovely if there's a kind of discussion, so that we all can, including very much myself, learn from each other. So Scottish Refugee Council are one of many human rights charities in Scotland, and there's a smaller number that work either in the name or in practice to support people that are seeking safety, seeking sanctuary, technically seeking refugee protection within the UK. And obviously we're talking here about Scotland, and the area of Scotland that I'm probably most able to talk about is Glasgow. I'm actually talking here not from Glasgow. I'm a Celtic fan. I can't hide that. It's behind me. There's a picture there. But I do originally come from Glasgow, but I'm talking to you from Linlithgow, so it's quite a change for me as a Glasgow boy. But I mean, Scottish Refugee Council, we work with and have worked with a whole range of people from all across the world for just over 30 years. And that has been people that most recently have came through the Syrian resettlement programme since 2015. And I think we probably all remember that really tragic image of the young boy, Aran Kurdi, who I think the tragedy around young Alan, I think, crystallised in a way that maybe images can often do. The full gravity, the full horror, the full risk that people are actually taking. More recently, we've had the tragic death of a family within the English Channel, and countless others, scores of others, hundreds of others this year alone who have died in the Mediterranean. And that's just, I suppose, the kind of the UK and the European part of this. And I know you've spoken earlier, and Sabine can talk better than I, and I'm sure she has, about the kind of the greater global context. But I suppose the thing is that the UK and Europe indeed take a very, very small proportion of people seeking refugee protection. It tends to be countries, and it has been for a long time, who are neighbouring, where the persecution, the human rights abuses, the gender-based discrimination, whatever the kind of the very severe forms of poverty that often underlie some of the above are intersect with it. It's people have came and seeking safety in neighbouring countries, and often countries that have got huge socioeconomic challenges, amongst other things themselves, that they're having to deal with. So that said, you know, the UK does have a proud history of providing sanctuary, and it does, you know, as part of that history, been supporting people through the kind of the main legal instrument, the Refugee Convention itself, and then underneath that, some of the kind of the key human rights legal instruments. The one that I always feel is probably the most important is the Council of Europe's European Convention on Human Rights. And the reason I'm talking about those kind of key legal instruments is, you know, that those legal instruments came from the kind of international community's, you know, revulsion at, you know, at the Holocaust, and the mass atrocity that was, and we at Scottish Refugee Council have never lost sight of that fact, and I don't think we ever will. And the reason I'm also wanting to flag up the Refugee Convention and its origins as well is that we do think it's under probably the first in European terms, and I think also in UK terms, direct attack than it has been for a long time. And by that I mean that we're anticipating legislation into the UK Parliament early next year, which will, we think, even though it will not say it explicitly, in practice may actually break the link between the UK state's kind of adherence to some of the core principles within the Refugee Convention itself, and essentially penalise people who arrive on the territory for the manner upon which they've arrived on the territory. Particularly people, which is the vast majority, that have come through so-called clandestine routes, and often have claimed refugee protection in country. It's about 80-90% of people claim refugee protection when they're in the country within the UK, as opposed to at the port or otherwise. So the reason I flag that up is I think that's something that we need to keep as human rights advocates a very close eye on, is that we are talking about, we think, probably the first kind of explicit attack on the UK state's relationship with the Refugee Convention itself. And then underneath that, as I mentioned earlier, some of the relationship with the key international legal instruments, like such as the European Convention on Human Rights. So in other words, you know, in terms of people coming from Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Syria, Eritrea, Ethiopia, we can look what's happening in that area of the world right now, often coming through from that part, like Libya, and some of the really high levels of exploitation and slavery that exist within that area at the moment. That people coming here are often experienced quite high levels of exploitation by the time they've came. And again, this came up in the short breakout room very quickly, and unsurprisingly, there's quite high levels of trauma within the populations, almost by its nature, through being forcibly displaced from everything that's precious to you, and having often arduous migratory and often exploitative and quite long journeys, including, amongst other places, in a very small number of cases, to the UK. And then when one's at the UK and is, you know, used their right to seek asylum, the kind of the right that's obviously in the Refugee Convention, but then more particularly within the Universal Declaration of Human Rights itself, that right in practice increasingly doesn't entitle one to the kind of rights and protections that one would hope that it would. So by that I mean, if one was to start from a socioeconomic perspective, that if I was somebody seeking refugee protection within the UK, I would immediately not have that right to work. That's not open to me to have, and all the dignity that can come from that. Often most people are destitute when they arrive, they don't have the means to support themselves. And often you'll hear the term asylum support, which I think is two things essentially. The first thing is to get a very small amount of financial support. And that currently is £39. Some paid 60 pence, so £39 per week per person. And it works out in terms of financial provision, approximately half of what the social security minimum would be. The other chunk is accommodation, which is provided on a no-choice basis, unless there's very exceptional circumstances deemed by the Home Office to pertain to an individual's case, such as severe torture that the Home Office accepts. It's very rare for somebody to be able to argue with the Home Office that they should be accommodated in a particular area. And so most people are accommodated by the Home Office through its outsourcing contracts. So, that one contract at the moment is currently with the Mears Group. It previously was with Serco. They operate in run asylum accommodation within different parts of the UK, including within Glasgow, which is the only asylum dispersal area in Scotland currently, and has been as such since 2000, and is also the biggest asylum dispersal area in the UK by quite some margin. Currently, there's about 5,000 people in the asylum process who are supported within Glasgow, which is about 3,500 more than the second area, which is Birmingham, which is 1,500, and there's Liverpool, similar numbers. So there's a lot of people, comparatively speaking, in UK context, in asylum accommodation in Glasgow, and that's been the case for almost over a generation now. And for people in asylum support, so getting that £39 per week, half the social security minimum, getting no choice provision of asylum accommodation, they're moved to essentially the areas with the highest levels of multiple deprivation, because that's the areas that have the cheapest housing. Is the kind of the blunt truth of it. It's like the contract for housing asylum seekers has been outsourced since 2012. That contract ran up to 2019, and then it's continued on for a 10-year contract. Just now, there's 3 providers: Serco in different areas of England, Mears Group in one area of England, as well as here in Glasgow in Scotland, and then a slightly smaller group, the Clear Springs Ready Home Group. And I think what's problematic for us about this is, firstly, that people have no choice in the accommodation itself. Secondly, it's all the resources are given by the Home Office to 3 private companies, and not any direct funding to those areas that are actually accommodated. So Glasgow City Council, Liverpool City Council, Birmingham City Council, any asylum dispersal local authority does not get any direct funding from the Home Office. So what that does is creates, kind of like a difficulty for those local areas to provide as much support as they would like to people who are seeking asylum and have been moved to those areas. And the housing in the areas is generally private housing, and at the lower end of the rental market. So generally it can be housing that's not really had a lot of investment in it for a considerable period of time. So you'll see, I'm sure some of you have saw that accommodation standards within asylum accommodation comes up often, and that's kind of a symptom of the kind of deeper problem, which is this is very cheap, traditionally underinvested in housing in some of the areas with the highest levels of poverty in the UK, and no direct funding to those areas, either through the local authority or the local health board. So you get a lot of kind of responsibility and cost shunting from the kind of centre, if you like, the Home Office, and behind it the Treasury, and to all these local areas which have very high levels of poverty and challenges to deal with. And that hasn't changed, sadly, even since the COVID public health emergency came, which has been very, very frustrating, because obviously, as you guys everybody will know here, is like, for the areas, COVID, like many other serious conditions, aggravates and hits hardest where you have existing underlying socioeconomic and therefore health inequalities. So, and also we know that people who are from, it's a very broad term, but BAME communities, as much as one can get underneath the public health evidence on the disproportionate risk for people in the kind of so-called BAME communities kind of umbrella, it does have, particular risks for people that have came and have got Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, South Asian origin. It does carry risks for people from West and Central Africa, which are higher as well. So it's a complex picture, as many people here will know better than I, in terms of that disproportionate risk. But let's just say it's been very disappointing. The Home Office haven't, we think, recognised that disproportionate impact and risk for, amongst others, people in the asylum process to COVID has not translated into better support for those local areas that are supporting it. But that said, the Home Office did, which we welcomed very much, in March when the COVID pandemic started, they did pause the cutting of asylum support, that £39 per week, and entitlement to stay in one's asylum accommodation, and therefore paused evictions as well, so that people could stay on that support and they wouldn't be facing evictions into street homelessness. Almost always is where people end up. And so that was very welcome. We think it was essential in public health terms. We still think it's essential in the current nature and escalating nature of the pandemic. But the Home Office have decided to lift that protection. In the 15th of September, they started to do that in England, and as you would hope and expect, there's been legal challenges in the High Court in London, which we've submitted evidence to, and we've been working very closely with local authorities and charities and some of the lawyers. The lawyers involved in these three potential judicial review cases, which are, we'd rather it not got to that case, but I suppose that's a kind of example of, we thought, a premature and irresponsible lifting of that protection from destitution by the Home Office in mid-September, which would have had the material effect, and in some cases has actually had the effect of people being made street homeless in some of the poorest parts of the country. So you would have saw as well, I'm sure, some of the tragedies that have happened for people in the asylum process in Glasgow since COVID started. And we've had sadly 3 deaths of people who were in the asylum process within Glasgow. There's been 16 deaths before COVID came. Between September 19 and March 20, there was 16 deaths in the asylum process, and we think the number may be higher. And we're talking with the Home Office about that just now. And then obviously, since COVID came, there's been, the death of the young man Adnan Elbi at Maclay's Hostel on the 5th of May. He was found dead. And then there was obviously the Park Inn incident, which thankfully nobody died in, but people incurred very serious injuries and trauma. And of course, the perpetrator was killed in that incident. And then there was more recently, which attracted an awful lot of media coverage, much of which we thought was very irresponsible, was of the young woman, the young mum, Mercy Baguma, who originally came from Uganda and was very well known to us and other people within the refugee sector. Now, obviously, the circumstance of each of those deaths have been investigated, and we're involved in some of that work to the extent it's appropriate. But I suppose our observation, our reflection on that is that there's a kind of wider, which is why I tried to kind of sketch it earlier. There's a wider problem with the asylum system as it's been constructed and ran in the UK, we think, for about 20 years. And we think it's essentially corroded the way that system's been ran has corroded the value and of what is something that everybody should be very proud of, which is that right to seek asylum, and therefore for countries and for for communities that are actually in the position of relative kind of like stability and, you know, life is okay, and is that's that chance to be able to welcome people who are seeking safety, as we've saw in Glasgow for a long time, that people do welcome. The communities often come forward, the churches come forward, you know, religious faiths of all groups, including very much the Jewish community, come forward and welcome people and help them in the practical ways possible. And the most important ways for us as people, you know, friendships, knowing where things are, orientation in terms of the policy jargon, you know, knowing where, about, you know, for schools and for health services, and just those really little things that are so crucial for somebody to have a sense of welcome and a sense of, actually, this is somewhere where I can get a little bit of peace of mind, that I don't need to be constantly vigilant and worrying, that I've got a chance just to have that bit of stability, mental stability, physical security that any individual needs, especially people that whose lives before have not had, have been riven with instability and loss and separation and all those negative experiences. So Glasgow's very much been that place. Obviously, we know Glasgow's not a perfect city. I know Glasgow's not a perfect city. It's like, but by and large, it's been a welcoming place for people seeking asylum, and it's seen it as a source of pride for the city's identity over the last 20 years, and that's a precious thing. And more broadly, as I said right at the start, Scotland, every Scottish local authority area now has people who have came through the Syrian resettlement programme. So we're talking about 3,500 individuals or so have came through that programme. And then more not more broadly in terms of volumes, but then there's a significant number of local authority areas that have had unaccompanied children from different parts of the world, and young people who have sought protection as well. You know, so Scotland in the last 5 years has very much, you know, broken out in terms of refugee protection from it mainly being in Glasgow. It's much more of a kind of national endeavour now, which is a good thing, and long may that continue. But I do think that in terms of going back to what happened in asylum in Glasgow, is that we in the refugee sector were not surprised people died. You know, we had been talking to the Home Office for a long time, and particularly since COVID, that we were really concerned about the conditions that people were living in. You know, so the people who'd been put into the hotels, which is, you know, it's one of those things is about, you know, it's better to be in a hotel room than to be in the streets. So you know, so that was there. But what we found in our discussions with the Home Office was that they seemed to think that that was sufficient. And we were saying, well, look, you know, we understand on a short-term basis why people need to be in hotels if there's nothing else. There's a problem that it should never have, the way you've ran the asylum accommodation system, there's not been any contingency built into it as we came into COVID, which is, so hotels have been used before COVID came. So that kind of rush by the Home Office, including in Glasgow, to just get people into hotel rooms was more of a symptom of the fact there was no slack in this system, there was no contingency in the system. But practically in the here and then in March and April and May, we were very concerned because there was a deliberate decision taken by the Home Office not to provide any financial support to people in the asylum process, which we were and continue to be furious about, because it showed a complete lack of empathy at the political level in the Home Office to what it would be like to live in an indefinite basis within a hotel room with no sense of control over your life. You know, that's why we talk about it as institutional accommodation as opposed to a hotel, because a hotel's not, and to be fair to hotels, they were never designed to accommodate people with this level of trauma, when the level of support that were provided or not provided with no real control of their life. They're there for leisure activities, business travel, holidays, you know, that's what they're geared up for. That's what the hotel staff were geared up to do. So the fact that the Home Office ignored the representations that we and others made about some kind of really key practical things was a source of dismay for us. And we did tell them from mid-April that we were very worried about especially the mental health pressures that people were in the hotels. And we know in some of the cases that played out in very, very tragic ways, especially the young man Adnan in the Clays, who was under a tremendous amount of pressure himself. So, and obviously this has played out a bit in Manchester as well, and some other parts. And then if one was to look at the next step on from kind of institutional accommodation is we've saw there's 2 military barracks now being used in Penally in Wales, very rural part of Wales, beautiful part but rural part of Wales, and also in Napier's barracks in Folkestone. And that concerns us as well because, you know, these are military barracks. They're not designed to accommodate people in this situation. The level of support, the lack of protection from, amongst other things, COVID transmission, the far right activity, which has been mobilised by people like Farage and then other groups that have taken their cue, both, you know, in terms of attacks in hotels and attacks in Penally, you know, are deeply disturbing. There's a legal challenge in the High Court this Wednesday against the Home Office's use of Penally, which we're very much hoping as a sector will be successful, because we really want to nip in the bud that military barracks should not be used at all for people seeking refugee protection. And we know that the Home Office have been engaging with the Ministry of Justice as well, which gives us even more concerns about whether that type ex-prisons might be getting considered for accommodation. So, you know, a reason I say that is that people are under immense pressure anyway, as people seeking refugee protection. COVID added to that pressure. And then they were put into hotel rooms or left quite isolated within asylum accommodation in some cases, and more generally. So we've done some research in this in terms of the biggest fight over the summer in terms of the impact of COVID. And the biggest finding that came out was that people felt very isolated and people's mental health was deteriorating. So over 40% of the respondents said their mental health had got worse, and it was quite serious as well. And we've saw instances of self-harm arising, etc. So, you know, from a empathetic perspective and putting one into the shoes of the people that are seeking refugee protection in the UK, they go into quite a difficult support system. And we've seen some of the extreme symptoms of that, we think, in the summer in Glasgow and some other parts of the UK. And tragically, within that, some people losing their lives. The asylum decision-making system is quite slow. And it was quite slow before COVID started. You know, so there was 22,500 in February this year who were waiting at least 6 months or more for just an initial decision on their asylum claim. And I think that's up to about 40 or 50,000 now since COVID. And we understand why there's been a delay since COVID started, you know, because, you know, decision making was slowed. But the reason I'm raising this is that there was like many of the problems that have become worse in the asylum system in terms of the Home Office's management of it during COVID, are aggravations of the structural problems that were there before COVID struck, in terms of very slow asylum decision-making process, people in limbo for quite a long period of time, inadequate support package, which then has resulted in, since COVID, you know, people getting shunted into hotel rooms or worse still, barracks. And when we stand back for this, we think, what has went wrong here? You know, that the right to asylum was for such a long time seen as a precious thing and institutionalised within states, including the UK, as something to be proud of. And then since really 2005, it's kind of like, we often talk in the asylum sector that the asylum sector got the hostile environment before the hostile environment was coined by the UK government in 2010, 2011, then 2012 particularly, as the kind of public policy of the UK government in relation to many people in terms of immigration status. And we're worried that, you know, it being the kind of like the precursor to the hostile environment in terms of some of the really dreadful asylum support provisions that are in place, that actually we're moving back now towards a kind of real weaponisation by the UK government of asylum through this. It's been mooted as the Fair Borders Bill, but we know it's going to happen. We know the legislation's going there. We've spoken to the Home Office officials. There is going to be new legislation, and we think that might break the link between the right to seek asylum on the territory of the UK and be supported and have your asylum claim heard fairly, and have a chance to be within communities, as opposed to stuck away in a barrack somewhere or a short-term immigration removal centre. And if that link gets broken through this legislation, then we're in uncharted territory in terms of the UK state's responsibilities under the Refugee Convention, and also its responsibilities under wider international legal instruments such as the European Human Rights Convention itself. And that very much is worrying, because the UK is not, kind of like peculiar. There's some very worrying, we think, kind of like trends within the European Union states themselves in terms of pushing people back out, away from European Union borders. Some of the suffering that's been experienced by people, particularly in places like Libya at the moment, and as I kind of touched on very earlier, we think is symptoms of that kind of push away by the UK state. So I suppose I should probably stop. Right, so the thing I would probably kind of conclude on is that, yeah, there's a lot of really worrying trends within the UK state's work in the asylum system, and lack of support within it, lack of political backing for the right to seek asylum. But we've got to hold on to the fact that the UK state, or that part of the UK state, which kind of like wants to kind of take that, does not represent many people across the UK, does not represent many local authorities and health services and communities across the UK. And in Glasgow and also my works across the UK, I see that every day, that I see that there's a real willingness to take responsibility locally and in devolved governments to try and help people. Often it's mitigating some of the worst effects of the UK system, but it's actually not. There isn't acceptance. Often there's a kind of revulsion at some of these approaches that are taken. So a lot of our work now is very much working at the local and devolved government level to kind of like build up that alternative narrative. And the fact that there are so many great community groups, including within Glasgow, who consistently go above and beyond to help people with the really simple but essential things for human well-being. Bodies like Refugee Ouija as a kind of example, as others. And to be honest, my work's in destitution stuff, and faith groups have always been there. They are the constant that's always there to help people, and that's not lost in me as an anti-destitution advocate.
Thank you so much.
So I'll best stop there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think you've given us an incredible amount to think about and reflect on, and to guide our conversation over the rest of the evening. I think you've highlighted very clearly that communities try and mitigate some of that broken system that exists, and organisations like the Scottish Refugee Council do absolutely vital work in terms of supporting asylum seekers and refugees. In our small breakout rooms, I was just asked a very important question, which is what exactly is the difference between a refugee and an asylum seeker. And I think that's something just important to say in a big group as well, in that an asylum seeker is somebody who has fled their country of origin and made their own way to come to the UK or another safe country, and then has applied with the government to receive refugee status, essentially, and receive safety in this country. So an asylum seeker is in that in between stage of being legally allowed in this country, but not yet having received refugee status. When people receive refugee status, then they're also granted the right to work. and many of the other rights and entitlements that UK nationals receive. But unfortunately, asylum seekers are in just a very big limbo normally, where they just do not have the right to work, are very limited extremely limited in the funds they receive, and therefore in their capacity to connect with their local communities. You know, even things like paying for coffee to see a friend becomes impossible with the limits that are placed on them. So thank you, Graham, so much for that overview and just highlighting the very difficult situation that asylum seekers find themselves in, and also from a policy perspective, how much work there is ahead of you, I guess, and many of us. Great. Graham, thank you for coming. Really appreciate that you were able to join us. And I think you said you might need to head off, but you're very welcome to stay and continue in our discussion as well, if you like.
Yeah, I'm going to have to go and check the kids. I can hear that they're okay, but I'm going to go and just make sure. So yeah, if that's okay, unless anybody had any kind of like questions you wanted to, I might just shoot off, and just to say, yeah, thank you very much personally, as well as on behalf of Scottish Refugee Council, for inviting us and giving us such a time to share some of our insights with you.
Really valuable. Thank you. Any questions? If not, we'll move on. Great. Thank you, Graham.
Okay, well, thank you.
This is a question I want to ask, Graham. There's a tremendous, nothing has changed since the Glasgow opened its doors in 1986 to asylum seekers. Why can't they be allowed to give them self-respect and allowed to work, because it leaves them wide open to corruption? I know the Home Office are very difficult to deal with, because I had an instance with it. I don't want to be personal, but to do with the refugees in 1986. They're very quick with doing one thing and promise you the world, but give you very little in return. What is this problem about them not allowing asylum seekers to work? And if they do work, then they won't need the help, the financial help, and mental health, and everything else. What have the Home Office got against it?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question, Carol. And I know I only touched right at the start on the fact that there isn't that right to work for people seeking asylum in the UK. And I think the honest answer, and I hope this doesn't come across as biased, because I think it very much is the honest answer in terms of objective, that there isn't any evidence that's ever been forwarded by the Home Office to say this two things. Firstly, that this is the right thing to do in terms of our management of immigration policy from their perspective, not to let asylum seekers work, and I suppose secondly is that there's never been a kind of any sort of convincing argument put forward to rebut the very strong economic and moral arguments for people to seek the right to have the right to work. So the Lift the Ban campaign is very much worth Googling after this meeting. And if many of you may have already aware of the Lift the Ban campaign, which we're part of and very proud to be part of, I'd give a shout out to Asylum Matters and Refugee Action at the UK level, who lead that campaign. And then bodies like Mary Hill Integration Network in Glasgow, who do a tremendous amount in locally and about that campaign. That's been running for about 4 years, and that campaign came from a deep frustration about the kind of irrationality of the Home Office, the ideological approach of the Home Office in not granting this right. Whenever I speak to people seeking refugee protection in groups and individuals, the top priority generally is people want the right to work. Because it gives them independence, the mental well-being and dignity that comes from that. And as it happens, it would save a lot of money for the UK state as well. And, and the Lift the Ban's work is I think it's estimated at 42 I can't remember the exact number, but we're talking about a very significant saving that would come from granting that right to work. Now, we know that some people wouldn't take up that right to work in practice because they're trying to deal with trauma and etc. Our expectation is that most people would. And many private firms, Ben and Jerry's have been the biggest example of this in terms of the Lift the Ban campaign, is the US ice cream company, but many private companies are backing this campaign because they can see themselves as business people that this is really senseless, because it is senseless.
Totally.
And the Labour Party and the SNP and the Green Party and the Liberal Democrats all support the right to work. So all the main opposition parties all support the right to work. That's now policy. So, I mean, if we have a change of government, and I don't mean this in any political way, I just mean in a factual way, you would have, in all likelihood, people seeking refugee protection granted the right to work. And yeah, sorry, I think you were going to come back, Carol.
Yes, I was going to come back in there with the Home Office. Is it an independent group led by people with lack of empathy, or is it a government project? Is it government ruled? Because the Home Office in 1945 were equally disgraceful with their attitude towards asylum seekers when they sent the boats back to Germany full of the Jewish Holocaust refugees. So nothing has really changed with their attitude. It's great, okay, open your doors, but we're not going to do anything to help.
Yeah, I think it's political.
I feel very angry about it.
I think it's political, Carol. That's our reading of it. That many of the officials, when we talk privately with them, see the sense in it, themselves. Because as people, it's a very strong case. It has far more arguments behind it than the case which we've not seen it. We've not seen, because it's not been produced, the kind of economic case for doing it, and it doesn't deter people. The one argument that often gets forward by the Home Office is it doesn't deter people, because people aren't coming to get the right to work. People are coming because they're fleeing persecution, human rights abuses. They may have family here, language support, all of the practical human things. That's what people are doing it for. It's not they're coming, and it's the same kind of nonsensical deterrence argument that's forwarded in the issues around the hostile environment policies more generally. Like the denial to access to healthcare was an example of it more recently. Charging for migrants to be using health was another example, and I suppose so and that's, I suppose that's the kind of the deeper issue, is about that it's an ideological driven policy, and it's very difficult to have a rational discussion around that policy, because it's not really where the policy's at. It's for ideological deterrence purposes, and it's very frustrating.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, both of you. I'm just conscious of time.
Sorry.
Thank you for that. It's a very, very good question and important conversation. I would maybe suggest that we move on to cover a couple of more things before we finish off for today, if that's okay. So thank you again so much, Graham, for coming. It was really informative. And
thank you very much. Thanks, Sabine.
Thanks.
And bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Right. We'll just move on quite swiftly. I think we're just have to skip a few things, and we won't feedback from our discussion, but I hope what has kind of come out through your conversation in your little groups is that there's a huge need when people arrive here. Many, you're talking about language, education, people need a roof over their head, and that's not even having talked about issues like opening a bank account and getting a mobile phone contract and having legal documents to access your entitlements, all these sorts of issues that people face when they arrive here. I'm just going to share my screen again and give you a very brief overview. of the type of things that people, kind of just integration in general. And then we'll chat about what we can do practically as well.
Sabine, excuse me, is there not meant to be a question and answer session moderated by Alan Kay? Because I think it's quite important that the group should be able to speak about what they're taking in at the moment.
Yes, I had planned that for the end, just after I give a bit more input in what people can do practically. But you're...
I thought the meeting was finishing in 15 minutes. What time is it going on till?
Yeah, we can maybe finish off in around 20 minutes. Is that okay?
Well, I think you should move on to questions now, so there can be more discussion. That's just my view, but it's up to you.
Okay, I'll leave that. Sure, why not?
Hi there, Sabine. Sorry, I think actually your presentation, if it's 5 minutes, would actually lead to some of the things that I was going to ask about, and lead people on asking questions about. And obviously, what we're looking at is, as a group, what dreams do we have for our community to welcome or include or support or empower refugees, and how we continue to do that. Another idea is probably what practical steps can we take to develop our support, to outreach to refugees. And the final thought is, do any of us have any personal examples of helping refugees and asylum seekers, or any of the problems that we personally have seen? So I'd like to open up to the group, and if I see anyone, if anyone wants to speak just now or ask a question, but if a lot of people want to, just raise your hand if you know how to raise your hand here, and we'll get to you. Does anyone want to start off the discussion?
That's Diana Wolfson with her hand up.
Okay, thanks. I didn't see Diana. Diana?
Yeah, I remember being at an Interfaith Scotland meeting way back when, and a woman stood up and said that she had personally opened her home to asylum seekers. And I was knocked out by that. I mean, she took in people who were totally unknown to her, and she welcomed them into her own home. So I suppose if somebody had a mind to do that, that would be an amazing thing to do. I really was knocked out by that, I have to say.
Thank you, Diane.
If you're based in Glasgow, I think that would be one of the top things I would recommend you get involved in. Destitution is one of the biggest problems that asylum seekers face in Glasgow, not having a home. Also, when an asylum seeker receives refugee status, they only have 28 days or so to leave their accommodation and find new accommodation without actually having any benefits. And so many people are homeless for a period of time, and that's where community members and mostly faith communities come in to actually offer up their homes to people for even a few weeks, to host them, so that to prevent street homelessness. And there's some great charities like Refugees at Home or Positive Action in Housing who enable you to do that in a safe manner.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let me just search and see if I can see anyone with a hand up, and I haven't seen anyone physically raising a hand, or anyone raising a visual hand on here. Is there anyone else wanting to ask a question or wanting to make?
Can I throw in a wee question, Alan?
Yeah, yep. On you go, Danielle.
So I think I've obviously been a few Scotch of the refugee meetings with Sabine, but I'm just interested to know in specifically women's issues and how women are affected differently by these issues.
Yes, there's as in every area of life, different genders are affected differently by issues. We see as women, as also pregnant women, for example, being made destitute. So there's just an increased vulnerability that people are exposed to in that sense. Single mums, for example, who are put in the same situation as everybody else. We've had children who are also being put in detention centres, small numbers, but nevertheless, they're there. I actually, a report was published just today about the gendered experiences of the asylum process, and I'd be happy to share that with you. That just kind of explains that in a lot more detail, more than we have time for.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'll do that. No
Thank
problem.
Was that Fiona Brody with her hand up?
Fiona, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I'll take from personal experience. No, I haven't personally taken in any refugees or asylum seekers, but one of my daughters has had several people who are going through the asylum process, or as you say, in the process between being an asylum seeker and becoming a refugee, but not having anywhere to live. And her experience certainly has been, it's been single mothers that have been worst hit by it. But I did want to ask a question. I personally would like to know the other ways in which we can help. If it is possible to fit in your presentation, that would be excellent. I don't know how other people feel about that.
Why don't I'll keep my presentation off, but I'll maybe just give you a very brief overview. I don't know if I had it on the screen briefly, but there are these indicators of integration, kind of those main areas that are key for people to become part of our communities. And some of those are very basic things like employment, education, health, and once those needs are fulfilled, so to speak, people seek much more. But in terms of the integration process, especially social connections are absolutely key. And interestingly, research has found that the integration process in general will happen a lot quicker for refugees and asylum seekers if they have social connections with locals. So I think we know it from all of our experience that, knowing where the better dentist is, or being forwarded a job opportunity, all happens through our friendship circles. And so a really key area that faith groups across Scotland have been involved in offering support is through offering friendships and meeting refugees and asylum seekers. And there are a lot of different opportunities to do that across Scotland, depending on where you're based. There's a number of befriending schemes in various cities and areas across Scotland. And what I would recommend you do is on the Scottish Refugee Council website, there is something called the New Scots Connect map. And various community groups are mapped out on this map who offer things like befriending, social activities, and that you can get involved in. You can also, I'll share my email address. You can also email me and I can just kind of refer, if you tell me then where you live, I can refer you to the right organizations. In Edinburgh, for example, there are obviously with COVID times, there are play groups for Syrian families that are always looking for volunteers, as well as a men's group looking at mental health. So there's various opportunities you can volunteer. And those social friendships are just absolutely key. What is also really important, again, is language. So supporting people to practice their English. Unfortunately, although refugees and asylum seekers have the right to receive language classes, there's just not enough provision, and many people just don't receive enough language practice or even access to language lessons. So there's a role that local communities can play as well, in terms of either having language cafes or just, a Tuesday afternoon, a few locals get together and offer a time to practice English together, or that can happen through befriending as well. There's a number of churches I know, for example, who've just opened up their cafe space for people to come and chat and practice their English and gain confidence. So that's another area as well. In terms of practical help, I think that the Hebrew community in Edinburgh has also hosted Kurdish refugees for local activities, which has been
they have, just to confirm, and also they did a collaboration with the Israeli community and Syrian and Kurdish people in Edinburgh. Quite a few good initiatives there.
Sorry, can I mention Interfaith Glasgow, who have run for several years a wonderful weekend club. Which is about giving those who are refugees or asylum seekers the opportunity to meet together, but also to meet members of the local community. Exactly. And to provide the opportunity for them to do the kind of things that we all like doing, you know, going for an outing to a park or a museum or whatever.
Exactly. And those things are so key. We can't, for us, it feels like, you know, maybe a minor thing to do, but those things are so key and they are life-changing for individuals. And I know that from the Syrian friends that I've befriended and myself, and that many other people have befriended. In addition, something in addition you can think about is giving people the opportunity to gain kind of work experiences. I don't know if any of you are business owners or where you're at, but certainly if you have the opportunities, or even within your faith communities, if you have a community cafe or so, giving people volunteering opportunities. Many refugees struggle to find a job just because they don't have UK work experience or don't have a UK reference. You know, you just need an employee reference from somebody. So if you're able to give somebody 3 weeks work experience, it makes a huge difference. And in terms of real impact as well, you can think about contacting your MPs and MSPs. Write letters about what you've heard today. It is so important that we actually change the system in and of itself. The asylum system, as we've just heard, is so undignifying, so inhumane. It treats people less than nothing. And so we need to use the voices that we have and email and say, actually, this is not right, what is happening. If you go to our website, you'll find some ideas of things you can write to your MP if you need some guidance on that. I'll put it into the chat. And before I talk too long, the last thing I'll put in the chat also is a link to a resource that we've just published. Unfortunately tonight we didn't have a chance to speak about a lot of what was planned, but this resource is called Sanctuary in Scotland, and it really explains very nicely kind of the reasons why people flee, integrate possibilities for integration, and links to all the important organizations that support refugee integration. This resource is available for free, so you can order hard copies, as many as you like, for your communities and friends. And yeah, I'll put that in the chat for you as well.
Thank you, Sabine. That would be most helpful, I think. Obviously, there's obviously differences between settled status and the various statuses of refugees, and I'm sure that would be something that we probably need to do in a follow-up meeting. But I see that we have someone else who's wanting to ask a question, so on you go.
Oh, was that me? Yes. Hi. Yeah. So just on a personal note, really quickly, so I volunteered with HIAS, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, for many years, doing a lot of those activities that you described, and it's immensely rewarding. And one of the reasons I'm here tonight is to learn a little bit more about that. So that's great to know that those sort of things exist. My question was going to be, just on like success rates for asylum seekers. Like in the United States, it's abysmal. Here, how often do asylum seekers actually kind of make it through the system?
So it's about 40%, I believe, that receive a positive decision after their application. However, people have the right to appeal the decision, and actually most asylum seekers do. And after appeal, another large amount receive status. So actually it shows that, again, the system is broken. People receive a no when actually they don't deserve a no. I don't know if you, the Home Office has actually admitted that over 90% of the people, for example, who cross the channel actually are in genuine need of protection. So again, what the media portrays in terms of these are economic migrants who just want a better life is simply not true. And even so, I guess there would be a argument to be made, why can't people seek a better life for economic reasons as well, when actually we can do that. Yes, again, the system is broken and the initial success rate is very low, but wrongly so.
I also have to say that I think migrants coming to this country bring success to this country and bring economic rewards, and I think that's a lot of people forget that migrants do improve the society here. So I think it's something that we've got to think of as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, is there any more questions?
I'd like to just make a comment. That I know that this is fictitious and it's a novel, but I think if you're looking to understand better the asylum seekers, that The Beekeeper of Aleppo by Christy Lefferty is really insightful. And her background is that her own parents were refugees in this country. And I really do think that it paints a very clear picture of what these people go through. So although it's a novel, I think that on this topic, it answers a lot of questions.
Thank you very much.
Yep, highly recommended. Mm-hmm.
I've read it too, it's great, yes, very appropriate.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I'll pass everyone back to Sabine. She'll tell us what's happening next. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, we'll draw to a close. You'll notice that even wasn't quite as planned, but I thank you that you've stuck with us. I hope you've found it beneficial nevertheless and could take something away. I just want to leave you with a quote.
Hang on, I think I have to do the vote of thanks. I think I meant to say a few words before you conclude.
Yes, I'll just say it. Yes, go for it.
Okay, so I just say them now. First of all, I think few of us can understand the pain and upset of somebody who comes to a foreign country because they cannot live in their own country where they were born for fear of their lives. It's almost inconceivable, pain and upset. And the fact that you are doing something to help these people is something we should take on board and think about much, much more. And I particularly, the event is being organized by 2 Jewish organizations, and almost the entire Glasgow or Scottish Jewish community originally were asylum seekers when it was much easier, around about the end of the 19th century. And I'd just like to say, Sabine and also Graham, you've really given us a huge insight into this, and it's been an absolutely wonderful presentation. And I hope our community, the Jewish community, will assist you further in what you do for asylum seekers. Every time I hear about Syria and hear the references to Syria and what is happening there, and how the international community has let this drag on with such inhumanity, and what is going on there, and how so many people are suffering in this day and age in this way. So I'd just like to say thank you for what you've presented tonight.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I'll just leave you then with a quote from Tima Kurdi. Tima is the aunt of Alan Kurdi, who I spoke about earlier, who died in the Turkish, in the Mediterranean. And she said, the world we choose has to be reflected in the actions that we take. The world we choose has to be reflected in the actions that we take. And so if we want a different looking world that welcomes the stranger, that is inclusive, multicultural, and dynamic, I guess, then it's our responsibility to also take actions in that direction. So I'd really encourage you to just think further about this topic. Order your resource, just read more on the topic, and do get in touch with me. My email address is there. I'd be happy to also chat with you on the phone out with this meeting and share some more ideas with you. So thank you so much for having me tonight and for coming.
Thank you, Sabine, for this event. I'm sure a lot of us have learnt something tonight, and hopefully we'll be able to share and do more ourselves.